Hello and welcome to the Bulletin with UBS on Monocle Radio. Each week, the sharpest minds and freshest thinkers in finance take you beyond the numbers and hype, right to the heart of the big issues of the day. This week, we're putting the Art Basel and UBS Survey of Global Collecting 2024 in the frame. This year's edition reveals continued spending on art and antiques by high net worth individuals. The largest survey of its kind to date, the report reveals insights into buyer behaviours in 14 global markets and the transfer of wealth between generations of high net worth individuals against a backdrop of challenging market conditions. Authored by cultural economist Dr Clare McAndrew, founder of Arts Economics, from whom we'll hear shortly, and conducted in collaboration with UBS, the survey examines high net worth individuals' spending, event attendance, motivations for collecting, and their interactions with artists, galleries, and institutions. Echoing insights from the UBS Global Wealth Report earlier this year, which projects an $83.5 trillion wealth transfer over the next 20 to 25 years, the survey also investigates that transfer of wealth between generations of high net worth individuals and how collectors are preparing to inherit and gift works of art. This year's survey gathered responses from over 3,500 such collectors across 14 markets, with Switzerland, Mexico and Indonesia as new additions. As well as Clare McAndrew, we'll be checking in again this year with the CEO of Art Basel, Noah Horowitz. But we're going to start with Bulletin regular Paul Donovan, Chief Economist in UBS Global Wealth Management, for more on the macro picture. Paul Donovan, always a delight. I guess we should start maybe with a little bit of broader economic context to these most recent findings. Give us a little bit of an update, because something we've spoken about so many times on this programme, of course, is this huge, probably unprecedented transfer of wealth that we're sort of in the midst of. That's, I guess, one critical thing to bear in mind when we're setting the context.
Yes, absolutely. We're actually at the start of what is often called the Great Wealth Transfer. So this is about $84 trillion at today's values, is going to transfer over the course of the next 20 years or so. Now, that transfer, it's important to note, is a mix. Some of that is going to be a transfer down a generation, so you're going to children. Some of it is going to be sideways. So we're going to see some of this wealth moving sideways to spouses. So what that means overall is that it's not just a generational shift, but also potentially a gender shift, at least in some cases, of wealth ownership. And when we talk about wealth, we talk about financial assets, but we also include within that the issue of art collections, which, while they may not be an asset, absolutely do form part of wealth. And so what you're seeing here is potentially new owners coming in to take control of existing collections of art and other collectibles. And that's going to be, I think, an interesting adjustment as we look ahead.
Well, yeah, and Paul, let me interrogate that in a bit more detail, because I suppose that's really interesting. Conversations you'll have with clients, I'm sure, will be about wealth preservation, but collection preservation as well. As we always say, it's not an asset class, really. It's something much more personal. It's much more emotional. Is that interesting when you consider both the intentions of these high net worth individuals who are leaving these collections behind and those, whether sideways or down the chain, who will be inheriting them? Because there's something different at play. It's an emotional conversation, not just an economic one.
It is, exactly. And obviously different people have different passions, different focus, different enthusiasm. I think what is interesting, for example, is that we have been seeing an increase in collecting of female artists. And that's something which perhaps chimes with generational and also gender shifts in ownership of art collections. So there are obviously some changes. Nevertheless, because there is also an emotional attachment, very often when we do get wealth transfers, people will keep at least part of the art collection that their spouse or their parents or whoever has collected, because of course that is emotionally associated with the person who has made the bequest. So a large number of people do have inherited works of art in their collections, and they do, by actually quite a sizable majority, intend to keep hold of them if they can. So there is, in spite of the fact that different generations may have different focal points, there is still a desire to keep at least part of the inherited collection.
Well, yeah, and I wonder, Paul, just as a sort of a corollary question, what about the collecting habits, more specifically, if we talk about types of artwork, for example? And I know that these findings are quite interesting, aren't they? Paintings still, of course, are very popular, the most popular medium, and maybe that sort of demonstrates that it might be a bit of a sort of plus ça change, plus la même chose, right, when it comes to art collecting.
Yes, I mean, I think there was a lot of noise about NFTs, for example, a little while ago. But actually, when it comes to art, people are generally looking at tangible, and the younger generations are maybe looking at different artists. And I already mentioned perhaps the rise of female artists as a point of interest, but they are still essentially collecting the same broad categories of art, maybe different artists, maybe different focal points to the work, but they are still collecting the same sort of broad pieces of art their parents and indeed their grandparents were collecting. So that is still very much, I think, part of the process. So when we look at different generations, I think there are obviously differences in taste and there are obviously differences in focal point, but actually the passion for art is remarkably similar across different age ranges and indeed around the world.
Paul Donovan. Well, next up, let's hear from the author of the Art Basel and UBS Survey of Global Collecting herself, Dr Clare McAndrew, the author and founder of Arts Economics. Clare, welcome back. It's always a privilege to hear from you at this time of year. Clare, give us a headline or two from the report as you see it first up. One thing that struck me was there seems to be some stabilisation of spending despite the challenging backdrop. But what jumped out at you?
It's a really interesting survey because it's a very uncertain time in the market. And at this time of year, we don't have that much hard data to go on. So these surveys are great kind of indicators. They don't tell us exactly where the market's at, but they give us some very strong indicators. And this year, we actually had the widest coverage ever. We had responses from over 3,660 high net worth individuals that were all active in the market. So it does give us some good indicators. And it's been an uncertain time in the market. We know that sales slowed and the backdrop hasn't been great in terms of economic issues and political problems and wars and things going on. But high net worth individuals still spending, still engaging in art fairs and other events, maybe a little less impulsively than we've seen kind of when we're in the aftermath of the pandemic, but maybe not taking as many risks, but they're still active and still spending. And I think the really interesting dynamic, which does parallel the wider research that we do each year, is that they're not just supporting the high end. And we saw that in the wider figures last year. They're supporting the market at lower levels as well. So we get this really interesting trend where values are actually stable or going down, but transactions are going up. So that's a really interesting trend we've uncovered again in this survey.
Yeah, and just to pick up on that point you made about collectors being less impulsive, therefore what they're sort of basing their purchases more on more deeply researched pieces. I guess that's interesting. Is that a generational trend? Because Paul Donovan spoke to us again about this bigger context of this unprecedented wealth transfer. Do we see that a new generation maybe of collectors approach their collecting differently, or is that deeper research base less impulsive? Is that something we're seeing across all these different demographies?
I think we're seeing it actually across the board. So it's not just kind of older collectors taking less risks and younger collectors taking more, or any kind of preconceived kind of notion we might have like that. It's across the board. People are spending at lower levels, which indicates a little bit of caution. They're not as willing to make the very, very high level purchases. And they're kind of anchoring on more traditional mediums. Paintings are still the biggest medium by far. I think we'd all hope that digital art would introduce a whole lot of new collectors, but we found the newer collectors were even more likely to be anchoring on kind of paintings, works on paper, sculpture, those kind of things. And we actually asked them directly in the survey about kind of their level of impulse buying, and that was right down on last year and the last few years. So people are getting more advice when they're purchasing, more external advice, and they're doing more of their own research. And that's across the board. That's young and old collectors.
Well, yeah, and just on that advice point, I know that you spoke, as always, to lots of art advisors and so forth. Do you think we can detect, Clare, a difference in the level of engagement with these kinds of other art experts and maybe the impact that that's having on the market more broadly, both in 2024 and what we expect to see going forward?
Yeah, this is a really interesting report because we've actually got 3 surveys in the report. So it's kind of stocked with full of information. We have the wider high net worth individual survey. We have a survey of VIP collectors that was sampled from Art Basel, and we have a survey of art advisors. And you can really see the value that's placed on art advisors by some collectors. I mean, they're not used across the board. It tends to be some collectors with a little bit more experience. But I think as the environment becomes more uncertain and as the price level increases, the use of advisors rises as well. And we do see the environment over the last 18 months has been more uncertain. So they're doing their own research as well. But if you're making any substantial purchase, you would usually have some kind of expert advice on it, whether it's a house or a car. You would go to an expert and ask them about it. And some of that's through the gallery and auction house infrastructure. And some people would prefer that independent advice also.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about confidence and optimism, Claire, because this is an interesting point we touch upon. And I know, again, in sort of Noah's forward to the piece, he talks about the general optimism or confidence amongst high net worth investors. Optimism, despite all the complexities, some of which you've alluded to, we said, spending was pretty stable in the first half. And a huge majority, actually, of high net worth individuals, although surveyed, remain optimistic both for the next 6 months and looking to the future. I know that Noah also picked out a sort of positive note struck by respondents from mainland China. Would you say broadly that the sort of the takeaway is fairly upbeat, pretty confident, optimistic about not just the short, but the sort of medium-term future as well?
Yeah, I think we look at it in different ways. So we ask people about their optimism, and when we ask them about the performance of the art market over the next 6 months and 12 months, it was over 90% of the high net worth individuals that we surveyed were confident and optimistic about how the market would perform. So that was a very positive finding, and it was higher than their confidence about the stock market. But we also asked them, I think their actions or their planned actions are sometimes a stronger indicator of what their optimism really is, rather than just asking them a straight out question. And we asked them about their plans to buy and their plans to sell over the next 12 months. And that was really interesting because 43% of the high net worth individuals we surveyed are intending to make a purchase. And that's down a little bit on previous surveys. It was over 50% in 2022 and 2023. And that's where we got those interesting regional difference. If you go to mainland China, it was about 70%. So very, very strong indicators of people planning to buy there. And what was quite interesting as well is the people planning to sell increased. So 55% of the high net worth individuals we surveyed were planning to sell. So we have that slight turnaround on previous years where there's a higher share planning to sell than there is planning to buy. And that could signal a few things. I mean, I was interested to see what the reasoning behind that was. It could be concerns over the market direction, whether people think the market's going to go down. But I think the fact that it's coupled with very high optimism in all of the regions really means that people are, I suppose, a little bit more hopeful that pricing and opportunities for sales are going to be better in future than they are at the moment. And again, going back to the art advisors, a lot of them saying, clients are deaccessioning from their collections, but it's more about kind of streamlining. And they often, when you're going to sell something from your collection, you don't necessarily sell from the top, you sell from the bottom. So whether these trends of more people planning to sell creates a boom in the market or not will really depend on what people sell. So whether it'll be a kind of an upsurge just in volume or whether it'll be in value as well over the next 12 months. But it was an interesting dynamic. When we spoke to the VIP guests from Art Basel surveys, a lot more bullish plans from them. 97% of those collectors that we spoke to, there was 1,400 responses from that survey, were planning to buy. So much more determined buyers in that group, as you would imagine, because they're kind of the inner circle, I suppose, of the art market.
Clare McAndrew. Well, Claire mentioned that Art Basel VIP cohort, and let's wrap up this special edition by checking in with the man himself. Here with the Art Basel perspective is the group's CEO, Noah Horowitz. Noah, welcome back to the show. Give us a little bit of your read on the backdrop to the piece, of course, before we get into the weeds of Claire's research. Some quite challenging market conditions, and yet some signs of stability and sort of consolidation. Just give us your take on the overall kind of backdrop first up.
Sure. Well, we're, now in the thick of the fall season, fall 2024. The market last year, we already saw some softness. The market was down a few percentage points year on year, 2023, and, has slowed further through the first half of this year. The major auction houses releasing their first half 2024 results that were down double digits. And so everybody's on pins and needles as the fall season picks up pace. And that's a result of a number of factors, obviously, continued high interest rates, geopolitical tension and stability, and of course, the U.S. elections, have historically tended to keep folks on the sideline, and I think we're seeing that again here. Nevertheless, there's a number of green shoots. I think we saw an incredibly successful and energized Fair Week in Paris in mid-October, and there's a lot of hope and optimism as we round the last bit of the year in terms of market activity and sales through the New York auctions in November, and then ultimately always with Art Basel, Miami Beach to round things out in early December.
Yeah, and let's look at the sort of data sets that we get from the report, Noah, thanks to Claire and her colleagues, of course, as well. How much of this whole process is about interrogating those discoveries, and then for you and your colleagues to look at innovative ways to ensure you continue to connect with galleries, to drive your businesses forward? Is it quite sort of linear, this process of looking at the data and then actually using that to inform your strategic decision making?
Yeah, I'd say there's nothing linear about it, but it is important to look at and to understand. One of the most salient through lines that we saw coming across Claire's research with UBS this year was the slowdown of Gen X spending at the very high end of the market. Coming out of COVID, a lot of that spend was really driving the upper reaches of the market and helped propel the art market in the 2021, 22 period. And we've seen an easing there. And so for us as a business, it's important to understand that. We are seeing a bit of a generational shift in collecting. I don't think that it's because younger collectors are necessarily not as present as they were before, but they're not spending at the levels they were. There's a degree to which it's potentially the case of, some speculation driving a lot of the highest prices, especially at the outer edges of the white hot contemporary segment. So we're seeing that come down to earth a little bit. And it's just a reminder in a way that, the market is extremely diversified, that we must focus for Art Basel, but also as an industry and a lot of the new faces coming to the game, and we have to create touch points. But then there's also, more steady state internal collecting audience that I think is stepped up as well recently, that's supporting prices, supporting the market, buying in value, and still spending a fair amount of money on extraordinary objects.
Well, yeah, and just to pick up on that point you made about the sort of changing patterns of behaviour as we see, different kinds of collectors coming to the fore. On this idea of this unprecedented wealth transfer, it's something we've talked about in this programme often before from a sort of purely economic point of view, but there is this unprecedented transfer of wealth. It's down generations, but it's also sideways, of course. I don't know, is it wrong now to look at this sorts of data sets and try and extrapolate how that transfer of wealth is going to reshape collecting habits? I mean, that's not, I guess you can kind of look at that, but that's not the point of the exercise, is it? It's to just understand your audiences, your markets better, right?
Yeah, well, look, I mean, I think also as somebody that came through, the world of academia, and in fact, I met Claire all those years ago, and, doctoral conferences presenting, analytical research on the market. We take these things incredibly seriously. At the same time, this wealth transfer that everybody's talking about is something that is incredibly important. It's also many years in the making. So it's not something that happens one day and is manifest the next. And I think as an industry and as a business, we need to go under the surface of that to understand, what that means. I think one thing that it means is that there's likely to be a lot of extraordinary blue chip art surfacing in the market for many years to come as wealth gets transferred from one generation to the next, and art naturally to pay taxes and potentially because of different interests is going to continue to come into the market. So I think one thing that we'll be looking at is what that means for the trade, and will the next generation of increasingly younger, increasingly more global buyers be looking and be willing to pay the same prices that their forebears were for those items? Or are there going to be different categories that younger generations that inherit this wealth move into? Those are pretty fundamental questions. We as a business are taking that incredibly seriously. It's something that certainly motivates us in opening up new outlets for creating touch points with these communities, continuing to move the needle geographically in terms of where we operate and where we market and try to bring in buyers and dealers and galleries into the frame, but also indeed, in the different offerings we have as a platform. Starting the Art Basel shop, the retail stream that we launched in Basel is another way of creating further touch points and connections with a changing audience that is engaging with culture and engaging with modern contemporary art.
Noah, talk to me about the relative decline of impulse purchases and the rise of more deeply researched acquisitions. That's a broad positive to emerge, right?
Yeah, it's certainly a positive trend. I mean, it's cyclical too, right? We see this across different market cycles. And, when some degree of speculation cools very high end of the market, in our case, $5 to $10 million plus purchases, we see a lot of value-driven buyers coming to the table and doing the research and buying extraordinary objects. And I think, we've seen that in the last 18 months. We've continued to see it, in Paris, an artist like Olga de Amaral, for example, who's, to some degree undervalued relative to her peers. Even Tom Wesselman, who was the beneficiary of an extraordinary retrospective at the LV Foundation, is another relatively undervalued artist if you comp Wesselman to his peers, whether it's Lichtenstein or Warhol. And so value is an important undercurrent always in our market. You see it more and more so these days. I think one of the other interesting insights that came through Claire's research was that, the wealthiest of the HNWIs that were surveyed, had an over-index on female artists. So we're seeing art by women becoming more and more in demand by those that are most, wealthy and at some level most engaged in the market. So I think that there's some interesting through lines, and I think there's enough material out there to support, the market in a very wholesome way moving forward. But everybody's having to work harder to achieve that. The cost of doing business are indeed high. Just moving art around the world is an expensive affair always, but particularly so nowadays with, shipping, transport, logistics, insurance continuing to spike. So there's a cautious optimism, I think, that pervades a lot of the market right now.
No, just one final question. I did want to ask you about the role of art fairs themselves, of course, the importance of in-person, something we're very wedded to, of course, at Monocle in all we do. And it's interesting, especially amongst high net worth collectors. They're going to more major events, more fairs, even than pre-pandemic levels. I know that in some of your Art Basel's VIP cohorts, it's maybe they're a little choosier perhaps about the number of events. So not across the board, but broadly across high net worth. This is good news, presumably, for Art Basel in all its iterations, right? That primacy of meeting people, seeing works, acquiring works, building collections and passions in person. Again, this is something that presumably to celebrate or to welcome at least.
Yeah, it's nothing we take for granted either. So, there's an increasing intentionality to where collectors of serious repute show up. We want to ensure that they're showing up at Art Basel fairs. We feel that they are. We want to continue to engage them at those events and in those cities and really make those moments in the calendar, which is now 4 times a year, starting in Hong Kong in March, then Basel in June, Paris now in October, and of course, Miami Beach in December. So it's something that we continuously invest in and ensure that our audiences are coming. It's something that we do hand in hand with city administrations, with local cultural institutions, with the gallery communities to create these extraordinary weeks. And buying happens in the halls of our show in the Grand Palais in Paris a few weeks ago, but it's something that doesn't end there either. We want to continuously drive our audiences to galleries to engage with their program beyond that. So that art fairs become part of a larger continuum of lead generation. But at a baseline level, absolutely, we're reassured by the extent to which in-person activity continues to be a compelling modus operandi for engaging with the market. And I personally believe it always will be. There's going to be a degree to which digital tools and information, accessibility of information online, and even for purchasing is going to propel the market further and open the market to new audiences, which is amazing. But in the end, it's a human business. It's a social affair, and people love meeting others, experiencing, these extraordinary weeks and seeing art in person as well. And I think, a fundamental part of that is not ever going to change.
And that was Noah Horowitz bringing us to the end of this edition of The Bulletin with UBS. Big thanks to Noah and his team, and of course to Dr Clare McAndrew and to Paul Donovan. Listen again and explore more at monocle.com or follow the programme wherever you get your podcasts. And as always, you can discover more and find out how UBS can help you at ubs.com. If you'd like to explore the report in more detail, head to theartmarket.artbasel.com. This is The Bulletin with UBS on Monocle Radio. I'm Tom Edwards. Thanks for listening.